Resuming the Stream 3 hearing, we're up to day 7, the final day, the KO team. Ms. Summerfield, here to introduce your team and we'll go from there.
Morning, sir. Behind you and on the screen beside me is Jennifer, who's going to be presenting today online. And then we've got Victoria and Veronica here to my left, sir. I'll pass over to Jennifer.
Ms. Gorbel, welcome to the hearing virtually.
Thank you, Commissioner. Good morning, Commissioners. A couple of preliminary comments. Firstly, I apologise for not being with you in person. I'm having a slight mobility issue at the moment, so I'm minimising my movements. Secondly,
can I observe that's quite a euphemism. We'll expect full details on a confidential basis.
Yes, thank you for that. Secondly, you'll notice that I'm on the bridge of the Starship Enterprise, and I apologise for that also. I was unable to change out my virtual background. Anyway, that will give you some visual relief, perhaps.
Well, it was an historic building, Mr. Chair. Heritage building, I thought.
Yes, indeed. Over to you. We have your legal submissions, which we've read. We've had briefs from Ms. Casson and Ms. Woodbridge that we've also read. So we'll go forward in the usual manner.
Thank you. I'm conscious that you have had a number of hearing days already. I'm not going to read my submissions. I just want to make some comments prior to handing over to our witnesses. I have had a little bit of a struggle figuring out exactly what to say to you about why we're here this morning. Because on the face of it, you might think that Kāinga Ora is not an organisation that's principally concerned with the protection of historic heritage. But to the contrary, as we outlined to you at the very first hearing appearance, Kāinga Ora takes its statutory mandate and obligations under its core legislation very seriously, and as a responsible public entity concerned with urban development and giving effect to the NPSUD in particular, this is a matter that it has concerned itself with, even though ultimately it may not be possible to discern any significant difference in the degree of intensification that might be enabled depending on whether you go down the heritage or character route in relation to the Mount Victoria townscape values. So just sort of setting the scene, the purpose of the Kāinga Ora team's appearance here is really in pursuit of those sort of principled issues that arise out of its core functions. Particularly, it wants to ensure that sufficiently robust assessment has been undertaken by the Council, that the most appropriate means of managing these values, or whatever they are, has been determined after that appropriate assessment. And ultimately to ensure that the NPSUD and the MDRS are implemented appropriately. So effectively our appearance today stems from a couple of submission points that Kāinga Ora has made principally in relation to its position on character. And so what you'll hear today, particularly from Ms. Woodbridge, is very much a continuation of the matters that she raised with you at her appearance in Hearing Stream 2. And in fact, a good refresher for that position is set out in paragraphs 7.1 to 7.9 of her Hearing Stream 2 evidence. So that would be my first request, is that you see what we have to say today very much as a part 2 of the piece of work that we presented to you in Hearing Stream 2, particularly challenging the adequacy of the council's assessment of the character qualifying matter. So in relation to the Mount Victoria Townscape character precinct and townscape precinct, the point that we're here to make is effectively this: there has been no comprehensive assessment of heritage values in that area. Some assessment has been done, and I don't think Ms. Casson and the council's specialist are too far apart in terms of the appropriate methodology for that assessment. However, as Ms. Casson outlines in her evidence, on her reading of the relevant studies and surveys, the methodology hasn't been completed to its fullest extent, and she considers that there is some evaluation that has yet to be undertaken. Acknowledging, of course, that the Doctors' Common area is one area that has been identified for its heritage values. So, following on then from that position, the Kāinga Ora view is that if heritage values are present to a greater extent than they have presently been identified, that is a Section 6 matter and requires potentially a different response than the imposition of a character or amenity-based precinct approach. Now, there seems to be some confusion from Mr. McCutcheon as to what relief Kāinga Ora is seeking. He thinks that we are now actively seeking the introduction of a heritage area. That is not the relief that's being sought. I think the way I would characterise it is that Kāinga Ora is encouraging the council to undertake further assessment to ensure that the appropriate response is being made to the values that are present. And that's coupled with the submissions we've already advanced to you in relation to the appropriateness of the assessment done to support character as a qualifying matter. I mean, Mr. McCutcheon, in his statement to you, says, I cannot support introducing a heritage area with insufficient evidence determining why the entire area meets the criteria for scheduling. And that's effectively our point. It may well be that a heritage area is the most appropriate way to proceed in terms of fulfilling obligations under Section 6. But our point is that the council doesn't have the evidence that it would need to make that recommendation. Essentially, Kāinga Ora maintains the view that the Mount Victoria area is potentially suitable for high density residential development in accordance with NPSUD Policy 3C. And it's always been the Kāinga Ora view that that qualifying matters, for example, shouldn't determine the spatial zoning. Effectively, the high density zoning is considered to be appropriate as a starting point, and then any qualifying matters that can be established on the basis of a robust assessment or other controls in accordance with, for example, the heritage provisions of the plan, then need to sit across the top of that and limit building height and density to the extent necessary. And that the provisions in the plan can be appropriately written around that. And Ms. Woodbridge will have more to say about that. It may well be, and Kāinga Ora acknowledges this, that provisions which are oriented more towards protection of a Section 6 heritage matter may well impose a greater constraint on intensification than provisions that respond to character and amenity. So that's acknowledged. The point that Kāinga Ora is making is that that's a determination that should be made at the time of resource consent determination, having regard to the values that have been identified and what's needed to respond to those values in terms of constraints on development. The balance of the matters that Kāinga Ora wanted to raise before you today are reasonably technical matters. Obviously, we're coming to you with the same message on design guides as we have done in previous hearing streams. And Ms Woodbridge is happy to take you through that, and obviously she has taken a similar approach as we did before you on hearing stream 2, which is that the heritage design guides design guide outcomes can be appropriately translated into the relevant policies in terms of outcomes and then used when assessing a resource consent application. And then she raises a number of points that she thinks are still in contention following the officer's report, which are intended to give greater clarity to plan users. Some of those relate to definitions and the application of consistent terminology. Commissioners, that's really the extent of what the points I wanted to raise with you. I'm happy to answer questions before handing on to Ms Casson.
Ms Caldwell, one question only, and it really relates to, as you say, the fact that this is a continuation of Kāinga Ora's position in relation to character areas. It's saying, if not a character area in Mount Vic, then what, if anything? During the course of the discussion of this hearing, the question has been posed about the fact that we have not to date considered the potential application of section 77K because there are existing character area provisions in the operative district plan. So the question is the discussion about adequate justification a discussion in the context of 77J and L, or is it a discussion about the adequacy in terms of section 77K? And so invite your comment.
Well, if this were being promulgated as a heritage area or a heritage precinct as a qualifying matter, then because of its section 6 antecedents, then obviously in accordance with the fabulous flowchart that we gave you at the last hearing session, there's a choice to be made by the council between the process it uses to establish that matter. The 77K process is an alternative to 77J. But in this situation, as I understand it, there was, for the area itself, there was no consideration that it might qualify as a section 6F matter or an existing qualifying matter. And instead, the council determined that it should be approached as character or a specific type of visual amenity. So that choice didn't need to be made.
My point is that if you read the start of so is your point that 77K is a substitute for 77J, but not for 77L?
I think that's correct. As I read the process, there's a choice of procedures for Section 6 matters, but if it's not a Section 6 matter, then you must go through the 77J process and also some additional matters set out in 77L.
Okay, I understand that. I'll need to think about that some more. Any other questions for Ms. Caldwell?
Good morning, Ms. Corbould. Commissioner McMahon here. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Thank you. I just need some clarity so that I'm not working on the wrong assumption. And there's a possibility of conflating some of the character issues with the heritage issues between Stream 2 and Stream 3. But as I understand, on the character front, the position of KO is that there's insufficient evidence been undertaken, particularly in relation to 77J, to qualify the discretionary qualifying matter and then to do the assessment on terms of the so what type implications in terms of costs and benefits and individual site assessment. That's the position that came through from hearing Stream 2.
That's correct, and you might recall that Ms Woodbridge offered a fairly comprehensive traffic light type table, yes, which set out exactly the areas where she felt the assessment didn't meet what was required.
Yes, and I think Ms Woodbridge, there was some movement on that traffic light assessment and on perhaps the side-by-side assessment, but there were still some areas of red left on Ms Woodbridge's traffic light assessment. And so that position applied to all character precincts, didn't it?
Yes, that's right. And
yes,
and the fundamental Kāinga order position is that character is best dealt with as a district-wide matter by an overlay mechanism.
Yeah, yes, I understand that. So when we and so just picking up on the chair's point that we all need to give some further thought to. You don't see Section 77K as an alternative to justifying the character assessment where there are operative provisions in the operative plan dealing with character. I mean, for example, the inner residential zones in the operative district plan are subject to a number of rules. Character type rules. Could not an argument be made that using 77K that the assessment can be done through 77K of those existing qualifying matters in the operative plan?
I'm just pausing for a moment on your characterisation of the character provisions in the existing plan as being an existing qualifying matter. I don't actually have the sections in front of me, but I had been, so my understanding is that the 77K process is more likely to be used for matters such as the Section 6 matters of national importance, but without being able to check the wording of the section. I accept that there may be other existing qualifying matters, and character may well be one of them, given the existing plan provisions.
Yes.
So I understand that.
Let's just assume there is a pathway there.
Yes.
The question then is, and I appreciate that's a legal issue. The question then is, to what extent is the information in the operative plan appropriate or applicable to a Section 77K analysis? Does it provide a material basis for going down that pathway?
Well, it certainly provides information, and it gives the council an opportunity to consider how well those provisions have worked to date to achieve their purpose in terms of protecting or enhancing character. But I think, so it's an evidential basis. It's an evidential base or a foundation for that assessment.
Yes.
But still, there are some fairly prescriptive matters that need to be determined under that process as it's set out.
Yes, and that's what I just want to very briefly ask you about. If you break down that evidential basis into two broad components, one is the eligibility of sites, and secondly, the evaluation of, notwithstanding that it might be eligible, what's the effect on density and height? Is it necessary? What's the cost and benefits in a broad sense? What's the fundamental difference between those types of evaluations under K compared to J for the issue of character?
I don't know that I'm in a position to answer that now. It may be that Ms. Woodbridge has a view on that.
Okay.
If it may assist,
Microphone.
if you start at, I think there's some confusion. If you start at 77K3,
Yes.
an existing qualifying matter that is in the operative relevant district plan only relates to those in 77I A to I.
Okay, not J.
Not J.
Okay.
Mm.
Okay.
And so the point here is that the character amenities are not 77I A to I. They fall within J. So if an amenity component is in the operative district plan, it does not sit in one of the what would be considered an existing qualifying matter.
Thank you, Ms. Summerfield. That's the answer I was looking for.
Thank you. It's always difficult when one's assistant is in a different city.
Yeah.
Sorry.
But yes, thank you. That is correct. So section 77K as a process is not available in that context.
Yes, but it would be in terms of any equivalent heritage provisions that were in the operative plan. Yes.
Yes, because those are section 6 matters.
Yes. And the nature of the analysis between, for say, section 6 matter between K and J, is there any material difference that you can point to in terms of both eligibility and the so what question in terms of what effect, the cost benefit analysis, that sort of thing?
Well, there's a more detailed process to go through in terms of what has to be in the evaluation report.
Under J.
Under J, yes. Need to demonstrate why the qualifying matter is incompatible with the level of development otherwise given by the MDRS or Policy 3, which is slightly different to the assessment under K.
Yes.
Must assess the impact of limiting development capacity, height or density on the provision of development capacity, assess costs and broader impacts of imposing the limits. So it is a more detailed assessment.
Okay, thank you. Final question is going back to what, I apologise, this is a lot of his stuff that's related to hearing stream 2, focusing on hearing stream 3 and the issue of the precinct, that's the Mount Victoria Townscape precinct. The position, as I understand, is there's not enough evidence to make a call on it, and well, with not enough evaluation to make a call on it as a character area. That's the initial position. I also heard you say that there's not evidence to make it a heritage area. Also, can you just confirm that that's the position of KO?
Well, I think that the position is that, well, our view is that we're not actively promoting it as a heritage area. What we're saying is that it could well qualify as a heritage area, but that the council hasn't done enough assessment to give it an evidential basis to make that call.
Okay, so
that's the thrust of Ms. Casson's evidence. She evaluates the adequacy of the work that was done from a heritage perspective rather than a character or amenity perspective.
Yes, and if the panel were to agree with that position based on the evidence of Ms. Casson, what's the next step that Kāinga are recommending that this panel undertake?
I think the only thing that could be done is that the council could be encouraged to complete the assessment in accordance with the methodology that's already been set out. Ms. Casson's conclusion is that the methodology set out in the Mount Victoria study is appropriate, but that it wasn't completed.
Yes, and that just raises the final issue of the time frame for that. Is Kāinga envisioning that assessment be undertaken during this process or through a different process?
I don't have any instructions on what we'd like the panel to do. Our position has to date been that the council, if the panel accepts the position that we've put forward in Hearing Stream 2 in relation to character as a qualifying matter, and determines that there is no sufficient evidential basis for that, then we would expect that the council would want to undertake further work in order to preserve whatever values can be confirmed there.
Okay.
We're not specifically requesting that the council be told to go and do that work. We're simply raising the point that there were a number of alternative approaches for managing and recognising the values in that area, and they haven't all been adequately explored or considered.
Right. And if the panel, I mean, this is all hypothetical, so please treat it as such. If the panel agreed, but found that they didn't have time to, and the time frame precluded that assessment happening within the time required to give our recommendation back to the council, and that left a potential gap in the provisions, what's your comment on the risk of not acting?
I'm not able to answer that question, unfortunately.
Is it okay? Is it something the matter should have, the panel should have regard to?
It would want. I imagine you would want to put that question to the council. But Ms. Woodbridge may have some commentary about the extent to which those values might be subject to current levels of protection.
Right, nice. That's fine. I'm going to leave it there, and I think we're probably signalled. Ms. Woodbridge has probably been taking some notes, 2 or 3 questions that she might want to come back to on a planning basis when she presents. In the meantime, that's all from me, Trevor.
Thank you.
Thank you. We should presumably pass to Ms. Casson.
I think so. Thank you.
So, Ms. Casson, is there anything additional you want to say, to highlight anything to us in your evidence before we ask you some questions?
Certainly. Thank you, sir. My evidence relates to the likelihood of historic heritage being evident in the Mount Victoria North precinct and the methodology by which it has been identified. My view is that the methodology is well intended, but in some places is out of sequence and has not been completed sufficiently to determine the presence of historic heritage in the precinct. I have read Moira Smith's supplementary evidence and note that we are in agreement on some points. Our point of difference is related to the incomplete implementation of the methodology, as well as the sequence of activities within the methodology. Ms. Smith states that the historic heritage themes are present at Mount Victoria North, but that they are more pronounced in other areas that the community has prioritised for recognition. This statement is of interest because in the methodology, the comparative study of like areas doesn't occur until the heritage assessment is completed. Ms. Smith's statement leads me to assume that a heritage assessment for Mount Vic North Precinct may have been undertaken, but not yet published. And I'm happy to answer further questions in that regard.
Thank you. Mr. Lutz, would you care to go first?
Ms. Casson, with regards to the methodology, I'm a little bit confused at the moment because Ms. Caldwell just told us that she thinks that you think that the methodology is appropriate, in her words, but has not been completed. You are telling us that the methodology is well intended, which I'm not quite sure if well intended and appropriate is the same thing, but the sequence is wrong and it hasn't been completed. In addition to that, you have got in your evidence quite a number of points of critique on the methodology. Can you clarify for me where you are standing?
Yes, thank you. I do think that parts of the methodology are appropriate, but the early parts of the streetscape survey discount sites that are not visible from the streetscape. They also employ a streetscape bonus as part of their scoring system, which I think disproportionately prioritises character above historic heritage. This information has been used to digitally map areas and start to define where historic heritage may be located. And I think that that part of the methodology has discounted too many sites too early in the process, so that they haven't been assessed beyond their streetscape appearance or amenity value.
Thanks for that. That makes it clearer. Now, the council, as I understand, has done these assessments not to necessarily identify heritage, but to identify the townscape character, or the townscape value, not to confuse words here. And I can, you know, I can see that second layer that comes on top from Kāinga saying, but they should have done more than that. But since they weren't intending to make this area a heritage area, but a townscape area, and there's plenty of places in Wellington when you walk around that could potentially be heritage, and we have heard many submitters to say this part and this part and this part and this part should be heritage area too. How would you think the council should have actually dealt with that? Is your opinion that everything should have actually been assessed if it is potentially heritage, including all the character areas that are out there? Because they all have houses that are pre-1930.
Thank you. I think if I can direct the panel's attention to the Mount Victoria Heritage Study, which both Ms. Smith and I have referenced in our evidence. This was the second phase following the thematic study that was done by Boffa Miskell, I think in 2013. This second phase of focus into the Mount Victoria area was undertaken in 2016 to 2017, and it explicitly states that it was its aim was to identify historic heritage, not character. To answer the first part of your question, the second part related to how do you define areas and why do we not just call everything heritage? I think goes back to my earlier comment regarding comparative analysis and the sequence of the methodology. So in being able to define an area, we look at its thematic contributions, we look at the representation of those themes, and then we do that comparison with other areas to see where those themes are best represented. In the way that the reports have been presented by the council, it doesn't appear that that comparative analysis has been undertaken until we get to the heritage assessment, which we have not seen for Mount Victoria North. The heritage study, 2016 to 2017, uses the streetscape survey to filter out sites or to filter out areas. And it's my opinion that process has happened too early before we have that comparative analysis with other areas or other thematic representations across the wider townscape or cityscape.
Thanks for that. Now, have you had a look at the methodology that council has actually used to assess heritage areas?
The heritage evaluation guidance?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you agree that this methodology is appropriate?
Yes. And we agree that I agree that the Doctors' Common heritage area is appropriately identified and assessed.
I want to ask you. Oh yeah. In your paragraph 6.17, you're making a statement with regards that the assessment was made from the street. How important, in your view, is it to undertake site visits, like actual site visits rather than street visits, to assess historic heritage values?
I think that's fundamental to understanding historic heritage. The issue with streetscape assessments, and as I've described, is that what's visually accessible from the street is only one component of assessing historic heritage. And in this methodology, in the survey methodology, which is appended to the 2017 report, it states that sites that were not visible from the street were discounted from assessment.
Thanks for that. Now, your Appendix 2, just as a clarification for me, the potential heritage area with sub-areas, how does that compare to the extent of the townscape area and the character precinct in that area that was proposed?
It's very similar to the townscape precinct, but it's extended beyond the townscape precinct area to incorporate other elements that I think should be assessed for historic heritage value. In some cases, this would be on a site-by-site basis, and perhaps there's heritage value within individual buildings. And in other cases, we've identified, obviously, the Doctor's Common sub-area and a potential second sub-area along the parade. And there's various reasons for that, which I'm happy to discuss if that's helpful.
Yeah, if you want to elaborate on that.
I think what is drawn or proposed in this appendix is a contiguous boundary, which I believe has justification for historic heritage potential, remembering that we haven't been asked to do a full assessment, and that these sub-areas have a relationship to that wider area, but also a cohesiveness of their own that it identifies discrete values that are distinct from the broader values.
Thanks for that. That's me. Yeah.
Ms. Casson, go to paragraph 3.1. You say Kāinga's primary submission sought. Kāinga made hundreds of submissions. Which one?
I might have to defer to somebody who has sight of all of the submissions. I was focused on those two. I believe it was the one about townscape view shafts.
Number.
We can get that number to you.
Mr. Chairman, I've got 3 specific submission point numbers in relation to this topic.
Can you give them to me, please?
Yes, number 3, number 178 and 239, but principally I think it's number 3.
I think Kāinga is 82.
391 is our submitter number.
391.
Yes.
Sorry, it's 82 in Pairua. Thank you. 3.2, Ms. Casson, additional view shafts are not being considered by council or not being considered by Kāinga. Which one?
By Kāinga in this instance.
So effectively, Kāinga is abandoning that relief.
That's correct.
Um, 4.7, where you say that could be improved in the future. Improved how?
That relates to the contribution that those sites make to historic heritage values. So in considering changes to individual buildings or in individual sites, historic heritage recognition would, and rules associated to that, would allow appropriate development to contribute to those established values.
Well, changes would necessarily be contemporary. How can that improve heritage values? It could. I could imagine it might make them less detracting, but how could they actually improve heritage values?
I think there's a very distinct place for contemporary responses to the historic landscape that offer a representation of contemporary cultural values for future generations to enjoy. Holding heritage areas in stasis isn't necessarily the intent of recognising them. It's about informing appropriate, proportionate and sympathetic intervention so that people can keep using those places.
And (5.5), you say you consider that the townscape precinct shows evidence historic socio-economic patterns and dwelling types, innovation in wind and earthquake design and technology. You could say that about virtually all of Mount Victoria, couldn't you?
I think that comes back to the point about comparative study and how these values are represented and to what degree they're represented in comparison to other places. I think they're very evident in this location, and that is sufficient for me to recommend further investigation.
And 5.7, saying these potential historic heritage values, high degree of public recognition and prominence because of their location. Is it their historic values that people recognise, or their visual appearance and the amenity values that come from that?
I think it is historic values, particularly because of the prominence of St Gerard's. I think that is recognised as an older building, and it's also representative of religious contribution to the cityscape. So people might not recognise it distinctly as historic values because they perhaps don't speak about historic values in their daily conversations, but I think those values are definitely legible, not just the visual aspect.
I suppose that this is my last question, but that was the thing that intrigued me. I could understand you coming to that view in respect of the image in my mind of the North Victoria Mount Vic townscape south of St Gerard's, but it's much more difficult for me to conceive that in respect of the view on the other side, on the north side, that has a whole lot of scrubby 5-storey concrete block apartments on Oriental Terrace and behind the Seven Sisters, where, at least to my untrained eye, historic heritage is not evident. Yes, of course it has it has St Gerard's over the top, but the view in the foreground is distinctly contemporary, appears to have no religious association whatsoever. So as I say, I'm intrigued as to how you could come to that view as regards the view from Oriental Parade.
Well, I think that speaks to the idea that it's not just the visual aspects of these areas that we're interested in protecting. If you walk a little bit further in and experience the area, you'll start to see the pattern of development or historic development, the streets that are accessed only by pedestrians, and there are some older buildings hidden away, tucked away. There is a higher degree of modification, contemporary building in that area, but there are still some quite interesting, from a heritage perspective, routes through that landscape.
Have you walked those
Of course
streets?
they have.
So have I, many times. I have to say that I've never been conscious of the historic values walking up Oriental Terrace, but maybe I've missed something. Commissioners?
Yeah, just a couple from me. Thank you, Ms. Kidd. Before I start, I'm not sure during these processes whether you get sick of the sight of seeing us, but we don't get sick of the sight of seeing you guys. So I'll start with that. This issue around, this recommendation around the need for a more robust assessment. And this may be a question for Ms. Woodbridge, so I'm happy to park it until then. If we're of the mind to do that, what would that look like?
I think that probably is a question for Ms. Woodbridge.
Okay, we can park it until then, because I'm just wanting to understand what the process would be if we're of a mind to do that. And also, while I'm here, Ms. Woodbridge, I'm particularly interested in whether. Sorry, for that same question. I'm particularly interested in seeing or understanding how you would see the residents being involved in that process or not. So that's something we can park.
I'm happy to talk to the assessment process if that's helpful.
Yep.
So at the moment, the Appendix 2 is casting quite a wide net. So that's from a preliminary understanding of the landscape, a walkthrough and desktop research, whereby I've identified the limits of what I think a sensible contiguous boundary would be. The process from there would be to prepare a written history of the area, which is something that the Mount Victoria Heritage Study from 2017 states as a deficit of their reporting. So they're looking to complete that work. For me, this talks to the sequence again, that would be the fundamental first step in being able to understand thematic values and then identify the historic heritage values within that. So I think that would be the next step. The heritage assessment is quite a complex and detailed piece of work, and through that process you would start to manipulate the border as you start to assess things with a closer lens.
Thank you. The only other question, just for clarity, at your 6.19, I think it is. Yeah. So the iwi undertook, the mana whenua undertook a process of identifying sites and areas of significance and other matters. I'm just wanting to understand what does 6.19, what would that look like with regards to cultural activity and sites of significance? So would that be over and above what's already been done, or would it be incorporating the sites of significance into the heritage study?
I think it's up for the council to decide.
Okay.
But I think it should be included. I think consultation is fundamental to understanding the not just the themes but the historic heritage values.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Ms. Kidd.
Thank you.
Mr. McMahon, I think we're ready for Ms. Woodbridge then. How are you?
Thank you. How are you? Sorry. Right. So you have obviously taken my evidence as read. I have also reviewed Mr. McCutcheon and Ms. Smith's supplementary evidence, and I don't really have anything further to add to that. I notice a number of places where Mr. McCutcheon has suggested some amendments, and I would largely agree with his definition of non-scheduled buildings and his inclusion of the word all for rules R15 to R18. There's nothing else that's particularly changed my position from Mr. McCutcheon's evidence. Obviously, we have already talked about the loop back to hearing stream 2. I'm conscious that Commissioner Faulkner wasn't present for hearing stream 2. If it would be helpful, I can recap on my position in hearing stream 2. If you feel
I think you probably should, because as you say, the other three of us are very familiar with your position, but Commissioner Faulkner is not.
Yes, so I won't labour the point too much, but feel free to ask any questions when we get to that stage. In a nutshell, for hearing stream 2, we put forward, or I put forward an argument that the work undertaken by council to justify character as a qualifying matter wasn't robust enough to meet the requirements of section 77L and to a lesser degree section 77J. Obviously the Mount Victoria North Townscape precinct is part of those character precincts, and so that naturally fell as part of that assessment. Through the process of looking at what was in the plan, the assessments undertaken for character as a qualifying matter, I went through a process of looking at the Townscape precinct, somewhat distinct from the character precinct, and looking at the strategic direction, the regional policy statement, and what was trying to be achieved through the Townscape precinct provisions that was different from the character precinct provisions. And it seemed to me there may be some heritage protection warranted, which differed from the character precinct, which is what has led us to this hearing stream 3 process and the involvement of Ms. Casson. So that's just a real quick whistle stop tour of stream 2, but feel free to ask any questions if there's anything else. So I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Ms. Casson. Woodbridge, sorry.
It's the V's, I think.
Thank you, my colleagues, for correcting me. Beginning it from both sides. Reading your I came up with only a few questions. You relied on Ms. Casson's evidence at 5:15. You're saying council's assessments for considering heritage values were flawed. Is that they were flawed because they didn't consider and potentially protect a wider area?
I think they're flawed in the ways that Ms. Casson has identified that the methodology wasn't necessarily entirely appropriate, if I'm not misrepresenting what Ms. Casson's opinion is there, and that there were some gaps in the work that hadn't yet been undertaken, and so there wasn't a full picture which would allow council to make that assessment, and I think that's something, as Ms. Caldwell pointed out, that Mr. McCutcheon has alluded to, that he doesn't feel he has the evidence to make that assessment.
Looking at the, you're saying 7.3, confusion over the wording of the definition of demolition. Just thinking where I find convenient copy. that definition? Do you have, can you point me to it?
Yep, I can. I've got the plan open. So if you just bear with me 1 second. Are you happy for me just to read the definition in the plan? Or do you want me to bring my computer over?
Yes, can you tell me, can you just read it out to me?
Yep, certainly. So the definition of demolition says, for the purposes of character precincts, means the removal, destruction or taking.
That was the bit that it says on its face that it applies to character precincts.
Yes.
I.e. not anything else.
Yes.
So you said there's confusion as to whether the definition is applicable to the historic heritage chapter.
I think what I meant there, so Mr. McCutcheon had referenced demolition in his section 42A report in the context of this hearing stream. So I was somewhat confused whether council were under the impression that that definition applied to heritage, because
so you say he referred to the definition or the term?
The definition, I believe. I'd have to go back to his section 42A, but if I mentioned it.
So that's what you bounced off. I got you.
Yes, yeah. I think through Mr. McCutcheon's supplementary evidence, I think we have cleared that up. I think it was just a relatively straightforward confusion.
.7, you said the use of policy 11 or the amendment to policy 11 to refer to the setting. Allows consideration in the context of the heritage area within the centre zones in light of the increased heights in the. Can you explain what you mean? I just put it in my margin, how, question mark.
Yes, so obviously the heritage areas are a defined area within a wider zone area. And the heritage areas have bespoke provisions, and the plan provides for different height requirements in the heritage areas. So if we envisage the wider zone developing at a higher density with increased heights, the setting of that heritage area within that wider area, I guess the context of it as an area with unique values, I felt it was important to consider that setting amongst the wider area to understand the impacts on the values.
But with what end result? What would consideration of this? What would the result of consideration of the setting, as you say, like the whole of inner Wellington's? You look out the window. If we could see it through the rain, you'd see a big bowl. The heritage areas are on the fringes of the bowl. Certainly Mount Vic is, Mount Cook is. Thorndon's not so much because it's more on the flat part, but at least with Mount Vic, it's on the fringes of a bowl. The centre of the bowl is going to increase in height and density. So what impact does that? What impact does consideration of that setting have on heritage management? How do you see? What do you see as the end result of the amended policy?
I think my reading of the policy 11 as it relates to height is really in relation to the centre zones rather than the residential zones. And I'm just checking the map here, but I believe some of the heritage areas in the centre are more surrounded by they're not so much on the edge maybe, or the periphery. And so they're setting in a wider context
So you're more thinking about like Courtney Place, which is a heritage area.
Yes, yeah,
So you're so I got you. So you're thinking of the heritage areas that are within the central city zone.
yes. So I think certainly my reading is that the height provisions relate to the centre zones rather than the residential zones, and policy 11, the height provisions and rules give effect to policy 11. And if we read, oh yes, sorry, I'm just reading policy 11 here. Yes, so it's with the city centre zones, and waterfront zones. So it relates to those zones specifically. It's Ms. Casson might have some thoughts on the relationship of the setting of the heritage areas in terms of managing the identified values of a heritage area. I'm not sure whether
Could I
that's
just go on?
under the
I've got a follow up before you do that. And 7.8, you're saying you explained why setting is important, and now you go on to 7.8 to say why form and scale. You say they contribute to saying why reference to form and scale should be removed. You say they contribute to overall values, but it's the values that should be considered. Does that mean that where form is not currently identified as a value, you'd need to consider as a heritage value whether you'd need to consider that it should be identified?
Oh, I think I haven't read and I can't every single value identified for the heritage areas, but my from what I have read is that it predominantly it sort of talks about above ground and below ground buildings, which would be form. So I think the form is part of the value. I think Mr. McCutcheon said in his supplementary evidence he's used the word form and scale to be more directive. I think what I'm saying is that those form and scale are an inherent part of the identified values, and that relating consideration to the values of the heritage area would naturally form to a consideration of the form.
The I get you, and that's why you come. But does that mean that you said you didn't read all of the heritage values? Does that mean that that's something we would need to be satisfied of when we review your evidence against the existing provisions?
Well, I think it's a question of, I guess, the more specific versus the slightly more general. I've gone on a slightly more general approach, which is the identified values, which are all listed in the schedule in the plan. So the policy relates to those identified values which are contained within the plan. So if you were a consent planner looking at a resource consent, you would then turn to the schedule, look at the identified values and consider the proposal in the light of those identified values.
Thank you. Commissioner Lutz, any questions?
Just one. In terms of the form and scale, I'm not quite clear what do you mean by form. Is form mass and bulk, or is form only the shape, or what do you consider form to be?
Yes, so the council's reporting officer outlined that in their 42A report and said that form would relate to different roof lines, mass, which contribute, and this is in the context of height, because this is a policy which relates to height. My understanding of form would be similar, that it would relate to a mass, roof lines, I've got to stop using my hands, and the general bulk of a building.
Okay, right. Thank you.
Is that another way of saying the appearance? That same thing.
I don't know, appearance maybe could be construed as, I don't know, if you're looking at a streetscape view of a building, the appearance might be what you see from that angle, whereas form maybe is more three-dimensional, yeah, as opposed to that perhaps two-dimensional view that you might have.
Understand, thank you. Mr.
Yeah, so just coming back to the earlier question I asked about process, what would the process look like if we were to agree with undertaking a more robust assessment of heritage? What would that be, an introduction of a plan change? What would that look like?
Yeah, I think given the tight timeframes, it's conceivable that that assessment wouldn't be able to be completed within the timeframes that are currently available. So yes, it could be a variation or a plan change depending on the legal effect of the provisions. But I think it's important that that work is undertaken in a robust manner.
The only other question I have is, in your evidence, you make the case for the design guide to be a non-statutory document to provide just that guidance. The question I have is, are there not issues or matters within the design guide that should have some sort of statutory weight? And if we take the design guides out, then the decision maker doesn't have the ability to consider what may be important matters.
I think if you just look at it in isolation, that yes, just removing the design guides, you may have a gap there, but I think what we're also recommending is that the relevant objectives and policies particularly, are strengthened to include those key outcomes. I mean, as part of this hearing stream, if we look at policy 7, it's quite a robust policy which has got quite a number of matters for plan users to consider and identify, which essentially have been pulled out from the design guide. So that's quite a robust policy. But then if you look at other policies which refer to fulfilling the intent of the Heritage Design Guide, they're less robust. They haven't got those key outcomes that are in the design guide. So yes, just removing the design guide would leave a gap, but having a robust policy framework that articulates those key outcomes would fill that void, and then the design guide becomes guidance to, I guess, fill around the edges of those specific outcomes that are in the policy.
Are you satisfied that there is enough robustness in the provisions to achieve that, or would there need to be changes to the policies and rules to be able to accurately take the design guide out to have confidence that the matters? And did you provide any suggested wording if there were gaps?
So through hearing stream 2, Mr. Heel provided some planning evidence on that, and Mr. Ray provided some urban design evidence, and I understand there's been some joint caucusing around this. It's part of a general issue relating to design guides across the plan, so I haven't provided any specific wording, but I think
there's some there somewhere.
I think in respect to the residential, it's being worked through. Our suggestion was that it may be appropriate to have the heritage design guides also included in that process, and I think Mr. McCutcheon has suggested that might be a good option as well. But through that process, I guess it's a slightly circular process. You need to ensure that the design guides are robust and fit for purpose, and that then informs the policies. So we've got a little bit of a circular process across the board, I feel. There.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just following up on that point, question I should have asked you earlier. I understand your position as it relates to the residential design guide. Of course, we heard from you at length, or might have been Mr. Heel on stream 2. The heritage design guide is written quite differently to the residential design guide. One of the issues that we discussed at length with a number of parties, including the council in stream 2 was that the extent to which the residential design guide was directive, and did it really mean to be directive, and if so, how directive? And that created issues with the juxtaposition between the policies and what the policy meant in terms of fulfilling the intent because of the content of the residential design guide. Now, put that to one side, shifting one step to the left, residential added to the heritage design guide. 99% of the guidelines start with the word either consider or consider carefully, which is demonstrably not directive. It's directive as to a process, but it's not directive as to an outcome. So the question is, does the heritage design guide attract the same issues as Mr. Hill gave evidence on, and is there quite the same need to have the heritage guideline sitting outside the plan, given that it isn't as directive?
I suppose maybe it's a question of process. If you're having consistency across the plan is ideal, and if you're having the design guides generally, it would be potentially somewhat inconsistent to have some design guides sit in the plan and some design guides sit out of the plan. I maintain that it's possible to provide for the required outcomes within the policy, and we did undertake a bit of an exercise where we looked at policy P7 in particular. We looked at the specific, if there's I think there's I to J points there. J is fulfill the intent of the design guide, but there's quite a number of specific points there, and we looked through the design guide to see how they related, and they did generally pull out the key principles of the design guide. And so to my way of thinking, firstly, it's good to be consistent. If design guides are out of the plan, they're all out of the plan. But secondly, I think it is entirely possible that those key provisions are included in the policies.
The give you an opportunity to comment. What the other thing I'm concerned about the I've discussed with Mr. McCutcheon already about a direction to put the heritage design guide into the same process, is that there are far fewer submissions about the content of the heritage design guide than there are about the residential, or as I understand it, about the sentence design guide. His response was, that's true, but that, and the follow-up point was, therefore it's not, in terms of sending the heritage design guide into a conferencing revision process, there is not the same scope. It's not open slather on the content of the heritage design guide. There's the submissions on are very much more selective about different guidelines, different aspects. His response was, yes, but there's the introduction and the structuring and the issue you're talking about, whether it's within or without the plan. And the concept in my mind is that is right, but that to the extent that a revision of design guides includes the heritage design guide, it should be limited to the matters that are common to other design guides. Do you have a view on that?
Yeah, I think it's important. I talked previously about consistency, and I think that's true. That relates to what you're saying, that it is important that language and structure and guidance within the design guides is consistent across the design guides to be clear for plan users and decision makers. So I think including, if you're going to have that process, then I think it would be beneficial to include all the design guides in the same process to have that consistency and ensure that the design guides are clear and fit for purpose.
I don't think you're answering my question.
Oh, sorry.
Because my question is that because of the limited scope to fiddle with the detail of the
Oh, I see what you're saying.
design guides.
Yeah.
That the extent to which it should be in a process should be limited to the common elements.
I think though fundamentally, if they're a non-statutory guide,
Well, it's not at the moment.
but if they do become, if through the conferencing, for instance, in the residential, it's decided amongst the group that that's the most actually appropriate way and that it can be anchored through the policies, then there is that component that they are then not actually subject to the same process because they're a guide.
Commissioner McMahon, I interrupted before you had you asked any questions.
No, that's absolutely fine. In fact, I just wanted to carry on that that line of questioning on the role of the design guide. First of all, I just want to acknowledge your Appendix A with the track changes. That's very useful, and your second appendix with the section Appendix B with the Section 32 assessment. I'll return to that in a moment. But on the design guide, and I'm looking at P7 in particular, and the changes you've made. I understand now what you're proposing, and Ms. Summerfield has just clarified it, where if the design guide is a non-statutory document outside the plan and it's anchored in the policies, then there needs to be the policy, in this case P7, needs to be quite robust. And I was expecting initially that that you might be looking at a wholesale rewrite of policy 7 to incorporate the outcomes of the design guide or the high values of it into that. But what you're saying is that that's largely there in clauses 1A to I. Is that the position?
Yes, when we went through the exercise of breaking down what was in the design guide, we sort of, did a table, and I mean, that's something we could share with you retrospectively if you were interested, but we just went through that process of breaking out the intended outcomes from the design guide to the policy. But I don't think that's the case. There's other policies which relate to the design, which refer to the design guide,
Yes.
and they are not as specific or as comprehensive. And so those policies, I think, if you were to remove the design guides from the plan as a statutory instrument, then those policies would need strengthening.
Yes. Look, it's up to you whether you share it. All I can say is that that goes to the Section 32 assessment. So I would certainly see it as being a valuable addition to your evidence. So really, and delete, sorry, I'll let you make that note. In deleting item J, which fulfills the intentions of the Heritage Design Guide, you've added a note which references the design guide and the Wellington Heritage Inventory. So what I take from that is that those two documents would do the heavy lifting in terms of assisting a resource consent assessment, albeit that those documents sit outside the plan.
Yes, yeah, I think the inventory is a really useful tool. There's a lot of information in there. If I was putting together a resource consent or assessing a resource consent, I would be looking, to understand as much information as I could, and I would go to those sources
Yes.
to find that. So I think it is worth referencing that document as well.
Okay, two questions arising there. The first is the Wellington Heritage Inventory. Is that a document that could change over time?
That's probably a question for the council, but possibly. It's an online tool, so it's a sort of more interactive tool. I couldn't tell you. It is possible that that's a live sort of document.
Yes.
Well, following up the Commissioner, if it is online tool, does it have to be locked down to a specific version?
Timestamp.
If it's going to be referred to in this way.
I had read it if you were referring to it as a note rather than a it's more of an information tool, that this is where you will find out the information that will help you, find out more detail.
Yes, I mean, the analogy is where there's an externally referenced document in a plan, it's usually timestamped,
Yes.
like Australia, New Zealand standard on wind farm noise, for example.
Yeah, I take your point. So yes, that may be an issue that would need to be rectified.
And the reference to the Heritage Design Guide, if that relief is successful, would be whatever happens to that in terms of its content.
Yes, the data version.
Yes. Okay. The counter to all of this is if the panel, and these are all hypothetical questions, if the panel decided not to agree with the relief that the Heritage Design Guide is outside the plan and non-statutory document, and what changes would be needed to clause J in that sense?
Well, I think
if any.
Yeah, I think we talked last time about the use of the word fulfills the intent.
Yes.
My personal view is that that's quite a broad and fairly potentially sweeping sort of, the intent of the design guide is to have good outcomes around heritage, protection, and in respect to the residential zone to have good urban design outcomes. That's the intent. What you're really saying is that you want a sort of the nuts and bolts of the design guide to be achieved through good design, I guess, urban design, if we're talking about residential, and respectful of heritage, protection for heritage. So, and this is why I keep coming back to having those specific outcomes in the policy, is you're wanting people to not just fulfill the intent, which is a good outcome, you're wanting them to achieve a fairly specific purpose. And there's multiple ways of achieving good outcomes. So the guidance is there to give you just that guidance as to how you might achieve those outcomes, but it doesn't have to be directive, because, I think as we talked about last time, design approaches and technology and things change over time. So
yes, the reason I asked that question, Ms. Woodbridge, and it's something you possibly won't be aware of, is in a different setting. In the Porirua case, there was a lot of focus on the equivalent to clause J, and the message we were receiving from Mr. Ray and Ms. Williams in that case was the focus should not be on the guidelines themselves, the nuts and bolts there, but rather they should be on a higher level, and they should be on the purpose and objectives of the guidelines. And it was there was wording suggested that use those sort of terms as an alternative to the word intent, and there was certainly some concern about the word fulfill or the equivalent word. So we're getting a similar but different message, if you like.
Yeah, I think if you're talking about, fulfilling the objectives, or fulfilling the, or being consistent with the objectives, or you're being specific there where you're talking about objectives,
yes,
then that's a little bit more specific than I think just the intent. Okay. To my reading, an intent is pretty broad, whereas if you're talking about, if there are a specific set of objectives behind the design guide, then that's actually a lot more specific.
Yes. I think the term, and it may have come up in hearing stream 2 here also, was the term, I think it was principles and objectives of the guidelines at a high level.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely defer to Mr. Ray in terms of his expertise.
The concept that was being presented was the purposes and objectives of the guidelines might be clearly stated in the guidelines. The way in which they are achieved, there might be a multiple way of achieving those in the guideline, the individual guidelines, all 200 of them in the residential, are examples of how they could be achieved, but not necessarily solely determinative.
Yeah, I think use of words like principles and objectives is, in my view, that is more is clearer and more directive than just intent.
Yes. Okay. I certainly understand that that's not your principal suggestion anyway, that you think that Jay should go, and the advice note should be added to bring in reference to a document sitting outside the plan.
Can I just follow up, Commissioner? You said a number of times it's clearer and more more directive, but you haven't said that's a good thing or a bad thing in your mind. Which is it?
Oh, I think it's important to be clear. I think being directive is important, but not to the point where you may be constraining, as you know, Commissioner McMahon referenced. There's multiple ways to achieve an objective, so you can be the policies and I guess if we're talking about the design guides, should be directive at a higher level, but not so directive that they would constrain opportunities.
That's
okay.
I'm going to leave it there on that particular matter. Just invite you to whether you want to come back with that table to supplement your Appendix B.
Can we just? You've offered to supply it. Can you supply it by the end of the day? Is it on? Is it readily? Is it in a form that you'd be comfortable just dropping it in our door, or do you want time to review it and make sure it's?
Yeah.
There are disparaging notes about either the panel or the council officers that you might want to excise.
No, it's more that it was sort of rough handwritten, so just need a bit of time.
So tell me, so you will need time. Give me a reasonable time for you.
End of day Tuesday.
End of day Tuesday, fine.
Okay. Two final questions from me, Woodbridge, and the first is relating to policy. Well, it was policy 11. It's been renumbered policy P12 in Mr. McCutcheon's version, and that relates to the height of development within heritage areas. And I've read this policy a number of times, and it confuses me. I'm not sure whether it's managing the height of development in heritage areas or in city centre zones or centre zones that are adjacent to heritage areas. What can you assist?
I read it as managing height within the heritage areas because I think standard S4 as it was in the notified plan, but I think it's now maybe S1 in the 42A version. So that has a number that sets out height standards. So my sort of tracking through was that that standard gave effect to this policy. So I had read it that it was relating to height of buildings within the heritage area.
Yes, I'm reading it now with the track change versions, which is a combination of yours and Mr. McCutcheon's, require the height of development to respect the setting and identified values of heritage areas in the central city zone.
I think actually, and I apologise, I should have corrected it at the beginning, at 7.9 I've made a bit of an error there in that my track change version has missed out the words form and scale. So at 7.9, yeah, I should have corrected that at the start.
Yes,
Or can I put, accepting that error though, is in the central city zone, centre zones and waterfront zone, is that qualifying the heritage areas or the development?
yes. And it's not clear to me because you could read it both ways. I mean, if it said require the height of development in the heritage areas to recognise. Yeah.
Yeah, I take your point actually.
So what's the answer? Which is it?
Yeah.
Well, I think, yeah, so I think because of the context of it, you would have to assume that it relates to the heritage areas because the standards and rules which give effect to it relate to heritage areas. But you're right, it's not.
Yeah.
Other than that process of that,
Well, maybe there's an opportunity for you and Mr. McCutcheon to liaise on that.
Yeah, that would be fine with me.
Okay. And like one final question, and it just goes back to the issue of the Mount Vic precinct, and it's sort of the so what question, if you like. Your paragraph 520 and your conclusions really create, based on the evidence from Ms. Casson, create doubt about the robustness of the assessment and You say you support the evidence of Ms. Casson, this is at your 520, and recommend that the council undertakes further assessment and consideration of options to protect the significant townscape values of Mount Victoria North area as a Section 6F matter, heritage protection from inappropriate subdivision development. I outlined the question earlier to your council. That is, when should that occur?
Well, as soon as possible,
Yes.
really.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're obviously in a tight time frame.
Yeah.
You know, it is something we've identified as a gap. It should be
Yes.
rectified, in my view. And I think, as Ms. Caldwell said, we're not preempting the outcomes of that assessment. But we're simply saying that without that assessment, you can't be sure that all reasonably practical options have been considered. And so
Yes.
that's what we're saying. So.
And
Yeah.
if I'm listening to the question, I didn't ask Ms. Casson any questions because I understood her evidence and speak the questions that my colleagues asked. But it seemed to me that it's not, there is quite a bit of work required to be undertaken. It's not an inconsiderate amount of work.
Probably have to defer to Ms. Casson on that because I'm not an expert in these assessments, but my understanding would be that yes, potentially there's a reasonable amount of work there.
Yeah, I've described it as complex and detailed,
Yes.
which does take some time.
Yes, I underlined that.
And
Yes.
it's important work.
Yes. So I guess the follow-up question from me then, Ms. Woodbridge, is if that work is not undertaken due to time constraints and delivering a recommendation to the council, is there a gap? And what does that mean in terms of Section 32, in terms of the risk of acting, or in this case, not acting, to protect that?
So I suppose it depends on the outcomes of the decision, that the recommendations. So if there are recommendations to continue with the precinct, then there are measures in the notified plan that will go some way, in terms of requiring consent for new buildings in there. If the panel is minded to recommend that the precincts as an amenity feature and are not proceeded with, then yes, I think there's a larger gap there.
Yes. Okay. Yeah.
So there is a greater risk. So I think the risk
Yes.
is sort of relative to the overall recommendations around the character precinct.
Yes. The relief being requested by your client is deletion of the character areas and further consideration of a heritage area. So that would provide the greatest gap and risk, presumably.
Well, I think in respect of the Mount Victoria area, what
Yes.
is the townscape precinct and the heritage. So the character precincts we've talked about in stream 2 and we've identified, but in this area we've got an additional layer, which is the townscape precinct, and it's that additional precinct that we're saying it may have some heritage values that should be investigated further.
Yes. Not quite. I'm very reluctant to set you some more work, but I'm not seeing. Well, you haven't specifically addressed that Section 32 matter in your Appendix B.
In terms of the risks around.
Yes.
Yeah.
If the townscape precinct was removed and there was no heritage area put in to replace it in the interim, what I'm taking from your response is that the risk would be greater, but I'm not seeing any written commentary on that.
No, I potentially to my 32 there.
I don't know how you want to handle that, sir.
Commissioner, if I could just intervene at that point, I think probably that's because, as Ms. Woodbridge has said, the risk of not acting very much depends on the view that the panel forms as to our primary submission point on the character precincts.
Yes, I think I understand that, but the issue is presumably that your Section 32 analysis should be assuming the relief that Kāinga is seeking.
I imagine if you were open to it, I imagine Ms. Woodbridge could rectify that omission quite quickly by the addition of another paragraph into that assessment.
I suppose is like, well, the question from Ms. Woodbridge is it a paragraph? Is it?
Because the assessment at the moment is solely on the design guidance matter. And to P11.
Since Council is busy volunteering you for a deadline of Tuesday close of business, is that reasonable given the amount of work required? Is it a paragraph? Is it a more considered analysis? Do you need more time? And if so, how much more?
I would want to do a more considered analysis, as I would with anything, because, you know, I don't like to give half-baked answers to things.
Should we say close of business next Friday
that would
for
be
both?
fine. Yep, that would be fine.
At the risk of getting in the way of the chair's cup of tea, where he always gets a little bit pitchy if we delay the cup of tea time. I've got one final follow-up. So the relief that you're seeking with regards to the design guide, just to run through a quick scenario. So currently in the design guide, there's things like sites and areas of significance to Māori, and it gives guidance about how these things should be considered with heritage matters, etc. So if it's in the plan, a decision maker could expect an applicant to at least have gone through a process of how they responded to that particular matter. I'm just using that one as an example. If we remove it, I don't see anything in the A to I that is a lever to, and just using this as an example, is a lever for someone to consider, in this case, sites and areas of significance to Māori. And without that, is that a risk? That's just one that, because you said earlier that you've done the desktop and you think that everything that's captured in the design guide is there.
I wonder whether the solution is that when Ms. Woodbridge reviews her table, that might the commissioner's question might sharpen.
Sorry, I'm trying to cast my mind back.
Yeah. No, actually, that's right. Yes.
So yes, that's something that I will particularly focus on.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair. That's it from all the team. Well, thank you very much, Ms. Caldwell, from a distance, those who are personally present and their supporters and observers. I'm grateful for your input, as always. I will do a follow-up minute, so I will mention the matters, but I think we're clear what we want and that you will supply it by close of business this coming Friday.
Yes.
Thank you, Commissioners. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you. We'll adjourn for my cup of tea. Thank you, Commissioner.
And a biscuit, hopefully.
Yeah, that's right. Too nice down in Golden Bay.
Yeah.
Ah.
Are you joining us this morning? Oh, sorry. You there? Cutter. It's Cutter here. It's on the Wellington City Council submission. It is
That's right. It is. So kind of exactly. Exactly right. the benefit is we've already had Maury present to us with evidence, Colin, so, yeah. But,
Yeah.
Do we just crack into?
Okay, well, back in session, have Tapu Dentis for Taranaki Whānui. Hopefully we might have Mr. Love at some point, but we'll await developments. I suggest you should start and we'll see how we get on. As Commissioner Faulkner observes, we have heard from Mr. Love sort of presenting overview comments on his context report. So, and the focus was specifically on the sites of significance that related to the airport, but he also talked about the sites more broadly in that vicinity. But over to you.
Kia ora mai tātou, nei rana te mihi atu, kia koutou nā komihana, mo tēnei māhere o te kaunihera o pōneke. O te anō rā ki tō tātou nei, tōku nei whanaunga, e rāwari nei rana te mihi atu kia koe, o te anō rā nā rārangi whakapapa I wainganui a tāua, me nā hono ki tēnei takiwā, tēnei katuku mihi atu kia koe, o te anō rā kia tātou katoa. Kia ora everyone, my name is Karapoki Tapu Dentis. I'm the chairperson of Taranaki Whānui ki te Upoko o te Ika a Māui. And I'll make reference to that entity as Taranaki Whānui for the purposes of the submission. I have, I guess, 4 points that I would like to raise with commissioners. One being the relief that we've sought as regard to, I guess, the component of mana whenua standing within the Upoko o te Ika. The second point being motu kairangi and our connection to that site. The third point being Papa Kāinga provisions, and that is a matter that I would like to, I guess, discuss a bit more deeply, hopefully with council officers, and just to sort of front foot that, I will be seeking relief from the commissioners to direct council to engage with Taranaki Whānui around the inclusion of Papa Kāinga, or the consideration of Papa Kāinga within the proposed district plan, as opposed to a plan change later on down the track, as has been suggested by council. And that's something that I'll talk to a bit more extensively in the substantive part of my submission. And the fourth point being the Wellington International Airport submission. I think I'll start there because I just wanted to note to commissioners that Taranaki Whānui and Wellington International Airport have actually had a conversation, and we are comfortable with the approach that we want to take together, and with respect of those sites of significance, and understand the confusion in that matter. And we have committed to working together in partnership. So there's a piece of work there that's underway in terms of developing a memorandum of understanding or memorandum of partnership between our two entities. And within that, we will be exploring how we actually celebrate and give effect to and give life to those sites of significance that that connect in within the Wellington Airport precinct, or more specifically around the Wellington Airport precinct. And that is a topic of ongoing discussion between ourselves and Wellington International Airport. And I must say that Taranaki Whānui is looking upon that relationship quite positively, and we think that there are some fruitful outcomes that can come out of that partnership, both for the two respective entities, but also for our city and for our country. So I just wanted to put that point there and clear that up as it relates to those PAR sites, which Maury would have spoken to commissioners about previously in the submission. And I don't think there's necessarily any further action that's required in that space, and that we will work with Wellington International Airport. The other point is in relation to mana whenua standing within the Wellington city area. And I must note that I have viewed other submissions from members of other iwi that I guess give an expression or a review around status and standing within Te Upoko Tika. And it's not uncommon for these things to happen. And I'm sure that you as commissioners are aware and have heard positions around status and standing of different iwi or different hapu or different settlement entities, one being above the other. And I think what happens in this situation is that you enter into these sorts of processes. You enter into an RMA process, a district plan process, and quite quickly these types of planning instruments flatten the rights and interests of Māori and create a general sort of position of standing and status within these types of documents, which create a conflict and an inconsistency with a te ao Māori understanding of how things actually operate, or how things actually are within our understanding of the world. And it's flattened for numerous reasons, because of the complexity, because of the legal structures that we have, because of the lack of sophistication, I would suggest, that we have within the current legislation. And so that creates for us an element of frustration and contention. And so I guess within this takiwā, it would be fair to say that Taranaki Whānui has a active, direct and physical presence within Wellington City. That is not to say that other iwi such as Ngāti Toa do not have standing within this space, but as it relates to this environment, as expressed by Maury in his articulation of his submission around the sites of significance, those sites of significance in their majority have a direct whakapapa connection to Taranaki Whānui or other iwi within this who were previously occupying space in this place pre-colonisation. So I guess there is a desire for that level of understanding and nuance within the district plan, and to give expression to that. And that is not too dissimilar to other district plans throughout the country. which provide for that level of nuance and distinction. So it's not like I'm asking for anything that's off the wall, or is too dissimilar, or is breaking new ground. Rather, just seeking a sense of understanding of that nuance and ensuring that these types of processes don't flatten our interests and flatten our rights and flatten our relationships within this area. So the other point that we would like to seek is, I guess, the significance around motu kairangi, and it is a space of significance for us within the Wellington area. It is one of Taranaki Whānui's largest rights of first refusal properties. Watts Peninsula is one of Taranaki Whānui's largest rights of first refusal properties, and that sits obviously within Motu Kairangi, which is formerly an island, Motu, and now is a part of that whole Miramar Peninsula and that whole area. And I guess for us, I think there is a desire to ensure that motu kairangi and how we treat that space within the district plan better reflects our aspirations and our aspirations around tino rangatiratanga and mana tuhake as it relates to that space. And it would be great to be able to see that better reflected in the objectives, policies and rules and standards over motu kairangi, and to give a sort of a further contextual and layering of our identity within that space. So that's something that we're very keen to explore. So if there is, I guess in particular, any rezoning or consideration of rezoning of that space, and in particular the old Mount Crawford site, that we get that opportunity to provide further input in the rezoning in the, I think it's hearing stream 8, which is probably where we would like to provide more direction and input into that process. One of the other things that, or the last point here that I would like to make is, and I've already mentioned it before, is the permitted activity, or we're seeking the permitted activity status for Papa Kāinga. And I guess one of the challenges that we have is that what we've been told is that Wellington City Council will look to undertake that work within a separate plan change process. Taranaki Whānui has signalled for at least the last 3 years that it's wanted provisioning for Papa Kāinga within the district plan. And I also think that it's not unreasonable for us to request that within this process. We've, as a part of our engagement in the spatial plan, that's something that we have signalled. And in the other formal documentation that we've provided to Council, that is also something that we have signalled. It is nothing new, it is nothing unordinary. A number of councils throughout the country have provided for papa kāinga as a permitted activity within their district plans. And I think it's unreasonable for us to wait for a plan change that may or may not happen to enable this provision to be provided for. So I guess in this regard, we're seeking that that the Commissioner's Direct Council officers to engage with Taranaki Whānui in a discussion around how we might start to integrate the provision of papa kāinga as a permitted activity within the district plan. And in that respect, I would also like to note that we come to that conversation very willingly, and also with the expertise and resource to progress that conversation at speed. So that for us is quite a critical piece of work, but also ties directly into the aspirations and desires of our people, as we have papa kāinga throughout our takiwa, in Waipatu, in Wainuiomata, and we want to look at other places within Wellington sitting, and I guess also recognising that throughout Wellington City there are a number of sites which were previously papa kāinga of our people. Of late, the council has actually done quite a bit of work in recognising Te Aroha, for instance, and working with a developer there in giving visibility to the pa with the Bellagio building on Taranaki Street, where people can actually enter and see where our people used to live. So for us, this is quite a critical consideration, noting of course that we are in a housing crisis, noting of course that many of our people are currently living in either emergency housing or in transitional housing. All we need to do is look at the occupations of people within motels, and you look at the demographic of those people. A good proportion of those people are Taranaki Whānui, a good proportion of those people are Māori, and we think that having a papa kāinga or having that provision actually creates enables a tool within a significant toolkit that we need to address these challenges. And I guess we see the issues now, we see the crisis now, and we don't really want to wait any longer. That's something that we're very keen to progress as quickly as possible, and would ask that council work with us to do that. So I think that's pretty much it from me. I note that Maury might have joined us and then might have popped off. Oh, no, there he is.
He's still there.
Maury, he kōrero pāhau.
Next question.
Kia ora koutou. Apologies for the technicality problems.
Commissioner Faulkner was suggesting, Mr. Love, that you needed a mokopuna to sort it out.
That's a lie. That's a lie. I deny that.
He's absolutely right.
Does Maury want to say anything first? Or,
Maury, did you want to say anything? I know you only just sort of caught the last end of it, but is there anything further that you would like to add, maybe in regards to the conversation that we had with Wellington International Airport?
Yes, thank you for that. Yes, the discussions with the airport were really for us to get on a mutual understanding about the sites, particularly those in its bailiwick or close to that, and they were similar in part to the discussions that we had, that I had with yourselves as the panel. Just one matter that hadn't been advanced was, and I know the airport was interested in, was Maupuia Pa, which existed around where the cutting is to Miramar, on top of the ridge line there. There was remnants of that pa as well. It was similar to Rangitotau. The people were the same, Ngāti Hini Pare of Naitara. And I think we've got a good understanding, mutual understanding of those matters. But I think the important thing, and it is in all these things, is relationship. And I think their understanding of the I'm talking about the airport, their understanding of the importance of these places to us, and our duty as kaitiaki over those sites is all important. But happy to answer any further questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Love. Commissioner Faulkner.
Kia ora. Te mea tuatahi tēnei te mihi atu ki a koe, te rangatiri kore au te tū, te mihi whakatau ki a koe, nā te mea noko nei koe. Engari, tēnei te mihi ki a koe mo tō mihi ki a mātou, te paipaine. Yeah, just saying though, for those who didn't understand that, I didn't stand up and welcome you because you're from here. So it would be inappropriate for me to welcome you here because it's probably more appropriate for you to do that to me. Just a couple of things that I wanted to pick up on your kōrero. And firstly, wanted to reflect that it was very succinct, and it was great to get that. Yeah, great to get that understanding. One of the questions I have is around ahi kā. What is it that constitutes ahi kā? What are the things that constitute a group or an individual or hapu or a group of people having ahi kā?
This is a complex matter for us in Te Whanganui Atara, and in some ways it's been a little complicated. But ahi kā, of course, in its simplicity, are the fires of occupation. And ahi kā roa, it is the occupation which really, in the transition of mana whenua status, first comes the raupatu, if you like, the events that happened, and the key one of those was the defence of Kapiti Island, of which we took part, and a number of other iwi of the Kāwhia Taranaki Alliance. That wasn't quite the complete conclusion of the raupatu. It was followed by an event, or it was preceded by an event. Followed by an event, or events and battles that occurred in the removal of Ngāti Ira from Te Whanganui Atara in 1827. These things combined for that changeover to achieve full mana whenua status. it is necessary then to occupy physically the space and maintain that occupation by the planting of crops and the harvesting of those. And of course, the Taranaki Whānui people came into particularly the Motukairangi Miramar area, planted crops, buried their dead, and developed their kāinga, sometimes on the sites of the previous tangata whenua. The Waitangi Tribunal in its report did what I thought was a peculiar thing, and it sort of talked about and this was in the Upper Hutt Valley, and for Ngāti Toa, that their ahika perhaps was established by use right, a much more difficult right to establish based on their use of some of the natural resources in the hut. That was the only exception in this situation. But of course, Te Aotearoa Taranaki Whānui has made ahika here or there and for the last 200 years without any break entirely. And only those of Te Aotearoa Taranaki Whānui maintained that occupation. That was only to change to some extent, but in a different way in the 1930s, when Wellington was looking to move Māori from the rural areas to the urban areas, and that shift that we all know that became much greater in the period of the 1950s. But that was not really and did not really establish ahika for any other people, although many of them now have long-standing and are recognised. But it's a different status. Long answer in that sense, but they're complex matters. Got it.
I think just to add to that, and to, I guess, sort of synthesize points there is ahika is that maintenance of presence within a space, and one of the translations of the word pōneke, one of them is pōtnik, one of the other ones is pōneke, to move at night. So within this area, we were moved out at night. And so, and a lot of us, we were moved out to Waiwetu, Hutt Valley, Te Awa Kairangi. However, we still maintained our connection and our ahika within this place. We have Papa Kāinga already within this area. We have Urupa at Upoko, and we have a marae in Pupitia. We have ahika in the space.
Ka pai. The reason I broached that is in the Stream 1 hearing for strategic objectives, Mr. Hunter, on behalf of Taranaki Whānui, made the comment that there are other things like land holdings, like customary rights to fisheries, to all of these other things that could be determined as a contributor to one's ahika status. And the context by which the panel is considering that is, we also had our Ngāti Toa whānau come in during the strategic objectives, and they made it quite clear that they felt that conversation is not one that the panel should be determining. It should be a conversation between the iwi groups who have the recognised mana whenua. This, so what we're grappling with is the kind of, if we were to determine the primary relief that you're seeking, what would be the best way to go about doing that, whilst ensuring that it's a mana enhancing process for all involved. So that's been a useful response. Sorry.
I guess in terms of seeking that relief, maybe, and I understand that point that Ngāti Toa are making, and I guess it's sort of the point is in language, in the language that we use around that. So maybe if we omit words like ahi ka, but actually have other words that recognise the difference of that relationship within this place and space between us and Ngāti Toa, expressed within the district plan in a way that aligns with the objectives and what a district plan is set to achieve. I think that gives us a greater level of clarity and takes out that contention of the word ahi ka, which is something that we can talk to with Ngāti Toa.
Papa Kāinga, as a permitted activity, where? And what I mean by where is it whenua Māori? Is it certain zones? Is it anywhere? So what I'm looking for is direction about if you're seeking a Papa Kāinga, because it was unclear in the relief what particular zones other than Motukairangi it would apply to. So just, yeah, where would a Papa Kāinga permitted activity apply?
I guess in that instance, we're predominantly thinking about Motukairangi and the area now known as Mount Crawford, or as we call it Matai Moana. That is the name of the peak, the highest peak at Mount Crawford. Oh, sorry, at Motukairangi. And obviously, also, I guess, consideration of other sites where we were formerly occupying, and those sites are now available to us for reoccupation. The Māori in me says everywhere. The realist in me says, that there are some realities here and there are some constraints that we need to consider. However, if we can think about sites that we know, and I guess also the point here is we didn't provide that further context around where, because we haven't actually been enabled to have this direct conversation about Papa Kāinga, because this process hasn't necessarily enabled it, because it's been sought through a separate plan change. So what we're actually seeking as a first step is Motukairangi and other sites, and we would be keen to work with council officers on possibly identifying other sites, or creating layers within the district plan that enable us to do it in specific areas. And it might have a level of variation in certain spaces. It might be permitted in others. It might be controlled in others. It might be restricted discretionary or discretionary in other areas. But I think it's incumbent on council to at least have that conversation with us now.
Bye. Because the challenge I have, and not to get into too much planning speak, but there's a whole lot of other mitigations that would be involved in developing policy direction that would impact on the rest of the plan, so to speak. And so I think one of the challenges that we would have is the practical mechanism to introduce such things into this process without throwing other processes into a difficult situation as well. I'm probably mixing that up, but there are, if it doesn't go through a plan change door and it's going to be introduced into this process, that there's a whole lot of process challenges that I think we would have to weigh up and consider. But I definitely hear what you're saying and what you're seeking to do, because I think the other thing too that needs careful consideration is not so much the where, but the who as well. So when we talk Papa Kāinga, who does that apply to? Is it anybody? Is it anybody who's Māori? Is it iwi? You know what I mean? So there's a, and I recognise that this has been done in a whole lot of other councils, but the context by which that's done may be may be different. So that's and the other thing is I'm not aware of many councils, if any, who have allowed Papa Kāinga development on anything other than Māori land. So, you know, there's a whole lot of, it might be tip of the spear stuff if we're looking at a broader application, but they're not things that can be answered today, but it would be good to turn your mind to what types of policy direction that may look like to meet the need that and the aspiration that Taranaki Whānui has for Papa Kāinga development.
In that regard, we have a suite of people who have put their mind to that matter, and we've actually, as I've said in the substantive part of my submission, we have noted this for the last 3 years to council that this has been our desire, and we're quite frustrated that we've got to this point, and we've been told that it needs to be facilitated through a separate plan change. And we understand and appreciate that introducing this now creates some challenges to your process and the process of council and getting the district plan over the line. But we have told council this, and there's a sort of okay, that's fine, but that's your problem, to be quite fair and to be quite frank. This has been signposted for the last 3 years. We've been wanting to have this discussion. We've had this discussion both formally and informally in the spatial plan process and the processes leading up to the district plan. And to get to this point and for it not to even be considered in the district plan is very, very, very frustrating.
I hear, I've got that message loud and clear. The other thing specific to heritage in the submission that Taranaki Whānui put in, there was reference in there to amend other chapters to give regard to the heritage aspirations that Ngāti Toa has, but, oh sorry, Ngāti Toa, Taranaki Whānui, geez, Freudian slip there, that Taranaki Whānui has, but there was no specific wording provided, and so it would be, because there's other things in there that will be addressed in other chapters, but for this particular chapter, it would be good to understand what that means. With regard, I think I know what it means with regards to the integration across to make it a more integrated plan, but that's me assuming that I know. So having some wording that would provide guidance to that would be useful. It's probably more a planning question for the planet, but that's, yeah, it would be useful to have that.
It is exactly that point,
yeah.
And we can provide some language to that effect.
The only other question I have is a comment about the Wellington International Airport corridor that you had earlier. It's not a question, but more a reflection that one of the things that I've observed in the hearing to date is a lot of applicants wanting to embrace or give effect to sites and areas of significance, but doing so with some level of certainty. And if that can be achieved in the conversations that you are having in an ongoing way with Wellington International Airport, I think it would be a good outcome for all parties, because it would definitely help the process, because I think that certainty is something that's a really a good outcome for both parties. Yeah. But that's the only questions I had, and just once again, thank you for coming in and sharing with us your corridor. It's been greatly appreciated. Thank you.
One question from me. Understand your point about, like you say, that the council and indeed the panel have an issue about getting the plan change over the line. I'm sort of the guardian of the process as the chair, And the issue that I foresee is that it's not so much, it's not even so much about getting the plan over the line, but it's carrying the other people with an interest in the provisions with us, because we have the population of Wellington. We've already heard from one submitter about development on Motu Kairangi in Stream 1. It's the other submitters with an interest who might not be entirely happy with Kāinga as a permitted activity, but who have a right to be part of the korero. How do we, like, as you say, we could direct the council to engage with you, but how do we pull in the other submitters with an interest who have a right to be heard, who have a right to participate?
Yeah, and I guess that's the shame of this process to date, is that we've got to this point, and this point that we have raised has been disregarded, and so that might mean that we need to re-engage with these groups and these people around their specific interests and concerns or aspirations around Motu Kairangi. I'm fully cognizant of the views of many of the people within Miramar around Motu Kairangi, and you know, we're also quite cognizant of the fact that that area in particular, Mount Crawford, is blighted by a prison of which our people were imprisoned in. It is one of the oldest prisons in New Zealand. And I would note also that I guess one of the key things that's driving Taranaki Whānui is when our leaders went to a former Prime Minister and sought to negotiate the return of Maunga Taranaki, the Prime Minister turned back to our leaders and says, well, why do you want Maunga Taranaki back? You've already got two mountains, Mount Eden and Mount Crawford. So there's a huge stain that currently exists with the presence of that building on that site. And the cultural connection to us as Taranaki Whānui is huge. And it is deep, and the provision of housing on there aligns directly to our aspirations as a people. Now, that is not in a way to be exclusive to others. We don't operate that way, and we are more than willing and open to having conversations with members of the community around how we provide for our shared aspirations on that site. But we are quite firm that as it relates to Motu Kairangi, as it relates to Matai Moana, we are the kaitiaki. We have a strong cultural connection to that site. There are a number of pasas that we have a whakapapa connection to into that area. There is I guess a need to ensure that we bring others along in that conversation, and we'd be willing to participate in that process.
Thank you. Questions, do you have any questions? No?
I won't relegate the Kāinga matter, but I just reiterate some of the matters that Commissioner Faulkner's raised about timing and the process and fairness to all. So there are challenges that the panel will face. But what I'm more interested in, particularly given the representatives from Waiala are in the room, is whether and we yet hear from Ms. Lester and Mr. Kyle about the discussions and arrangements that have been dealt with. But have you had a chance to read Mr. Kyle's evidence?
Not as of yet.
Okay, Mr. Kyle sets out a planning solution to be applied to the airport zone framework in his paragraphs 27 to 30. And I wondered, and Mr. Kyle will no doubt address this, whether that was something that Taranaki Whānui was no longer comfortable with, or no longer comfortable with, or is it a case of you haven't had a chance to consider that yet? And the reason I've asked that is the question that I have to you is what relief do you now require in terms of your submission and further submission in relation to the wild position, or are you happy to defer to the airport to present that to us?
In that regard, I am happy to refer that to the airport. We have had a discussion about this. I think there was a level of confusion around this matter, and we have come to a point where we are comfortable that actually, the provisioning of these sites of areas of significance we have articulated to Wellington International Airport that they are important to us as Taranaki Whānui, and that we ensure that they are provided for and that they are reflected in the district plan as significant, because ultimately we want to ensure that our identity and our connection to this place is not further scraped off, or we have had discussions, and Maury has pointed out all of those and their significance, and there are hopefully, well, the intention is that there will be future conversations around how we meaningfully celebrate those sites and give effect to their history and share those histories throughout our city.
Sure. The other reason I asked that question is that, notwithstanding the broad agreement and the memorandum of understanding that's been referred to, there may still need to be some changes in the district plan to deal with this relationship of an overlay to a district-wide rule to a zone chapter. And Mr. Cole's suggested some solutions in that respect. So I guess trying to understand the position of Taranaki Whānui on those matters, but you've already indicated you're happy to defer to Mr. Kyle on that. Okay, we'll wait and hear from that.
On that basis, I think we're done. Thank you very much for your input and for that, Mr. Love.
Kia ora.
Kia ora. Thank you.
Thank you.
1 minute to spare. We got
Kia
ora.
So speaking of the forces of aviation, so how would you like to proceed?
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members of the panel. maybe I'll just do some introductions because it's been a while since we've been here. I'm John Kyle. I'm a planning consultant that sometimes helps Wellington Airport with planning matters, and we're assisting with this district plan. So I think this is my second appearance, and we're planning to come and see you again on other chapters as this unfolds. But with me is Ms. Jenna Rayburn. Jenna is the GM Corporate Affairs for Wellington Airport, and Joe Lester, the Planning Manager for Wellington Airport. And I just wonder, Jenna, if it would be useful just to start with whether you would like to acknowledge the previous presentation from Taranaki Whānui and the extent to which the conversation has progressed and where it might be going, just briefly.
Kia ora koutou, kia ora kara. I think Kara has covered off.
You push the button.
Is it picking up? Is that better now? Kara has covered off, I think, where we've got to in our conversations, and as was mentioned, we are working towards a memorandum of understanding with Taranaki Whānui and towards ways that we can celebrate and acknowledge the sites of significance on our land holdings. We've had very positive conversation, and it was, I think, never our intent in any submissions to suggest that the sites of significance were not important or shouldn't be acknowledged. I think we were seeking through our submissions a degree of clarity on some matters, but we feel that our concerns have been resolved through the kōrero that we've had, that we have a positive relationship to work on moving forward.
Which is a fantastic segue into what I'd like to do next. And thanks for that, Jenna. I put her on the spot. We didn't discuss her speaking.
You want to be careful doing that to your clients.
She's pretty well equipped to deal with these things. So Wellington Airport would actually like to refine the relief sought in its submission to respect the conversations that have been had. And what we've done, and I hope this is helpful, we've actually taken the submission and made those refinements. And thank you, Joe. And Joe is just going to circulate those to you.
Thank you.
And while she does that, maybe if I just point out that one of the reasons for suggesting that Form House failed, these sites should be taken out of the plan, was to preserve scope, which you'll be familiar with. Having reflected on that and looked at the way that the submission is, there is no need for that particular point of relief. Quite simply, if you look at the page, at 482, the first page, you can see that whilst relief can be dealt with simply by looking at the planning framework that applies, and there is no need to suggest that the sites of significance should be deleted from the plan. And as you would have seen from my evidence, I've done a little bit of thinking about how that might work, and in the light of discussions recently and including yesterday, I've done a little bit of further thinking about how that relief might be developed, which I think goes to your question before, Commissioner McMahon. So I think if I could just leave you with that document, it will be self-evident what the changes are. But by all means, ask me any questions you might have about that. It's certainly moving on to my evidence, it's not my intention to read that to you or even summarise it. If you recall, I suggested that one of the key issues that drove the Wellington Airport submission was an inconsistency between the infrastructure chapter and the airport chapter. The infrastructure chapter has a special way of relating to sites of significance to Māori, and that's been missed in the airport chapter as far as we can determine. So we'd like to try and address that. And I made some suggestions in my evidence about how to do that, and I guess I've refined my thinking even further since drafting that evidence. And it's not something I think that needs to be resolved today, because as you know, the airport zone infrastructure chapter are in different hearing streams coming up, and what I'm going to propose to you is that we go away and do some drafting with respect to the airport chapter. We do that drafting insofar as it relates to sites of significance to Māori in partnership with Taranaki Whānui, where that can be achieved, so that both they and the airport are comfortable with what we propose. I'm not sure how much time we've got to do that, but we'll get on with that as an action. But what I'm suggesting, and just so you understand the mechanics, I suppose, if you're familiar, and you might not be, but if you are familiar with the infrastructure chapter, it includes a specific section titled Infrastructure Other Overlays. And in particular, that refers to sites and areas of significance to Māori. So it has infrastructure has its own standing in the plan because it's important to all of us. Wellington Airport is regionally and nationally significant infrastructure, but by virtue of the national planning standards, it has its own chapter. And arguably, the infrastructure chapter isn't relevant to the airport because it has its own chapter. But some of the elements of the infrastructure chapter that work reasonably well are missing from the airports chapter. And what I'm suggesting in particular is this infrastructure other overlays matter, which is included in the infrastructure chapter, and probably something like that should also be inserted into the airports chapter. So the way that the various provisions play with one another is clearer. So just looking at that infrastructure and other overlays chapter, it basically, where resource consents are required, it includes a provision which is a policy, and it's INFOLP 62, which is one way of expressing a policy in the title. And it deals with adverse effects of infrastructure on, including other things, sites and areas of significance to Māori. And then it basically has a hierarchy of consideration, I suppose. So first, it's about giving priority to avoiding the adverse effects of substantial upgrades to or the development of new infrastructure on the values and attributes of the above overlays. So that's the first management response. And where the avoidance of adverse effects under Clause A is not possible, the appropriateness of the substantial upgrades to or the development of new infrastructure will be determined by having regard to the matters listed in INFP 6. Now, that's in a different part of the infrastructure chapter, the INFP 6. But essentially what that does is sets out a range of considerations for assessing resource consent applications in those circumstances where that infrastructure provision may affect sites of significance to Māori. I've had a look at INFP6, and I actually think it probably needs a bit of work, particularly in the light of some of the comments made by Mr. Love to us yesterday. For example, what that does is it sets out how you might manage adverse effects, including construction effects where they can't be avoided. You take into account a bunch of things. There is no provision for consideration of things like offsetting or compensation in that particular provision, and that may be a useful addition when dealing with sites of significance to Māori and how to manage any effects on those sites, particularly if they're modified or not so easy to discern in terms of aerial extent. So I'd like to go away and have a bit of a think about how that works, certainly talk with Taranaki Whānui and the airport about what that looks like, and suggest at the appropriate time when the airport zone is up for consideration, suggest a management approach that works and is largely consistent with the approach adopted for the rest of infrastructure, not airports and ports, as it happens. So I hope that sort of tracking through the myriad of plan provisions has been clear enough. And it is one of the things I suggest in my evidence. It's just that I've thought a little bit more about how that might look and ultimately shape up. The other suggestion I made in my evidence was to play within the infrastructure chapter. I guess I'm less warm about that. I don't think it's sophisticated enough to properly address the issues of significance.
At the moment, Mr. Kyle, as you're aware, the airport chapter and the infrastructure chapter in different hearing streams. The airport chapter first, I've just been looking that up because I'm trying to remember where various things have landed. It strikes me that this is a discussion for the airport chapter at the moment. That's scheduled for November. We're thinking about that, but don't treat that as cast in stone. The good thing is that if it's moving anywhere, it's moving back. It's not moving forward. My understanding of the national planning standards is the intention is that infrastructure chapters be standalone, and the provisions you've noted reflect that. And the problem is that having hived off the airport chapter, you've lost the fact that that's standalone as regards the interface with SASMs. Understand that. Understand the point you're drawing our attention to. I think that is the smart play. You've got a relationship with Taranaki Whānui. A wise team might be consulting also with Ngāti Tawa, but that's over to you. As regards the SASM chapter, understand your change of position. The only thing that I want to talk to you about the SASM chapter is that I had a discussion with Mr. McCutcheon arising out of your evidence about how Rule 3 is supposed to work. And his answer was, if there are no key features, if there are no key sites or features listed in the schedule, Rule 3 doesn't apply. And I observed to him that the rule doesn't actually say that. It's ambiguous. And he's gone away to think about how we might clarify that. Now, if, as I say, he comes back with some amended wording that says what I've just said to you, if there are no entries in the fourth column of key sites or features, then rule 3 doesn't apply. Presumably that would suit the airport very nicely. But I'm giving you a chance to tell me, is there anything we haven't thought about?
Yeah, I was aware of the conversation that you're referring to. I guess as a first observation, I don't think the rule is particularly clear.
Too many identifieds.
Yeah.
Not clear what it is that's being identified. But as I say, he said that the intention is, and then it becomes a drafting issue how to make that intention clear. And he's got a way to think about that. And the question is, in terms of the issues you've raised, is that a helpful amendment?
It's hard to say until I see it.
Fair point. But as I say, I think that's more about whether the redrafting achieves the intention. If you just focus on the intention, is the intention what you is the intention one that you would support?
Well, as I understand the airport's position, it's quite happy to be subject to these rules, so that any activity that may have an effect of modifying a feature can be properly considered in the right context and according to probably the approach I mentioned before that is available to the infrastructure infrastructure providers via the infrastructure chapter. I don't think for a moment that the airport's much interested in any sort of cute drafting to exempt it.
The thing that suits us least is ambiguity, as long as there is clarity around what the integral features are that we're required to protect.
Well, at the moment there are none.
Exactly.
At the moment there are none on the 2 features that are within the airport precinct, and the effect of the discussion I had with Mr. McCutcheon would be that rule 3 would not apply to the airport because there are no integral features identified.
And
if
that
make that clear.
If that was the case, that certainly wouldn't mean that we wouldn't look to protect the sites in any way that was appropriate. The
way the SASM chapter is structured is that there's one layer, one rule for areas and features generally, and another rule where key features are identified. And what's not clear on the face of the rule is what happens if there are no key features identified.
But I guess part of the complexity here is having had a discussion with Taranaki Whānui yesterday about these sites. Whilst the plan doesn't recognise that there are features integral to those sites, there are in fact features integral to those sites. And I think that really throws the cat amongst the pigeons in terms of how this rule might ultimately be refurbished and looked at, because I imagine that's not an isolated case. And it's a case, the situation here is that the SASMs have been mapped. Sometimes features integral have been identified, sometimes not. But I would have thought all of them have features integral to them. It's just that they probably haven't been identified for the purpose of the plan.
The next question is how the plan can address integral features that are yet to be identified.
I think you've asked Mr. McCutcheon to look at that.
Yeah. On the basis that a problem shared is a problem halved, how do you suggest he addresses it?
Well, one option, and this might take some effort and it will need some time, is to be to have the schedule better identify features integral for all of the sites in question. So a complete picture is provided by the schedule rather than one that appears incomplete from the discussions that we've had with Taranaki Whānui. The problem again though is sometimes it's not just the site, it's the whole place that has significance, and how you distill that into a schedule also has its challenges.
Yes, lots of challenges, not many solutions.
So yeah, having a look at that schedule, including more detail, is one way of dealing with it, and that places quite a burden on a range of people to beef up that schedule. There will be other options, but I haven't thought about them yet.
Well, on a process basis, given the schedule doesn't identify, as you say, or may not identify all of the key features that are in fact present. There's no submission that I'm aware of identifying what would need to go on this schedule. Is this a future plan change?
The process matter probably looks like that, yes.
Okay.
Can I just jump in to respond to another point that you briefly raised? I just wanted to be really clear that we've had several rounds of correspondence with Ngāti Toa on these particular issues as well, and a long-standing positive relationship prior to that.
They've given us a letter that you've written to them, so I was just bouncing off the emphasis on engagement with Taranaki Whānui.
Yes, and we're certainly in the future looking to develop MOUs with Ngāti Toa as well. That's something that we've suggested, which is not quite as far progressed as with Taranaki Whānui, but we're certainly looking to do that in tandem.
Commissioner McMahon, any questions?
Yes and no. I guess I accept that there's some further work required, Mr. Kyle, and formally altering the submission is very useful. So I appreciate that being done, as I expect Taranaki Whānui do also. So just acknowledging that. I've made a number of notes about the solutions, whether they sit in the infrastructure chapter, the airport chapter, or the SASM chapter, where they affect the SASM chapter, and whether that's a change to Rule 3, or to make it clearer, or whether that's a change to the schedule, which may require a future process, such as a Schedule 1 process, is something I'm interested in, because the infrastructure and airport chapters are some time away. So, and it may be that there will be deliberations in advance on the SASM chapter. So I just don't know how that fits in with the time frame.
Yeah, certainly one thing that might need to be looked at is if you look at the second page of the SASM chapter, there's reference to other relevant district plan provisions.
Yes.
I think that should be more comprehensive and probably address also the airport zone.
Yeah, I picked that up.
And you've taken me back to Rule 3.
Yes.
I've been I've been grappling with this for a few days as to how you might look at modifying that rule without having to get more certainty, I suppose, in the schedule. And I think it's a little difficult to do without at least looking at the schedule and I don't like to use the term ring fence, but better ring fence the features and the sites in question and the values for which they are significant for.
Yes.
The value's integral. I'm not sure that features in integral is a very certain way of drafting a rule at all. I think if it were me, that term would be purged because it's very subjective and could be interpreted in many different ways.
Particularly if it's not informed by the schedule itself.
Yes, and that's my point about the schedule having to be bolstered to include those features so that everybody understands.
If you look at a spectrum of solutions, and this is hypothetical, one hand there's that very simple solution of confirming that there are no integral features on the schedule and therefore you don't trigger rules.
Or the simple solution is to say the integral features are the ones identified in the schedule.
Yes, and if there's none identified,
yes,
then the rule's not triggered. By the end of the spectrum through to a situation where the schedule does all the heavy lifting by identifying what those features are. And I think the suggestion is that's going to take a little bit of work. And from a process and fairness and procedural aspect, might necessitate an additional process like a first schedule process.
Yes.
With what sits in between those two ends of the spectrum, I'm not sure, but there may be nothing. But that's the options, and certainly we don't have a first schedule process. We don't have. Well, that's for another day. We can either deal with the scheduling matter right now in terms of what's on it, or Rule 3. And maybe that's why I've identified Rule 3 as the matter to focus on at this point.
Look, I understand that, and I understand your aversion to even thinking about another first schedule process in order to look at the schedule itself. These things will take time and effort. But at the end of the day, it's also important to get these things right. Yep. This plan will be around for a long time. It won't be 10 years, it'll be 20. Is there a place in between? Possibly there is, but that would, I think, I can't design that one on the hoof for you.
I understand.
But certainly would be happy to go away and take a look at it and come back with a suggestion if that was helpful.
I think if you've got any bright ideas, close the business today week would be good. And if the answer, having thought about it, is you don't have any bright ideas or you haven't, then an email to the hearing administrator to that effect.
Done deal.
Yep. Final matter, Mr. Coles, just a clarification. In your original evidence, you've quite rightly pointed to a potential issue with ramifications to the port zone if we went through and changed the infrastructure chapter to address wild concerns. Is that still an issue given the focus now on the airport zone and the SASM zone?
No, it wouldn't be if the focus was to rectify the airport zone. Yep. I don't think the port's much interested in the airport zone and vice versa.
Yep, good to know. And that's all from me, thank you.
Just one quick question. I've been informed by a very reliable source that when we go past lunchtime on a Friday, your mind tends to turn towards other activities. So I will keep this brief and
mine.
Yours, yes, to Friday afternoon activities. But the question I have is, I had a whole lot of questions around the relief that are somewhat redundant now, given your the different approach that's going. And I think it's important not to lose sight of the intent whilst we work through the policy direction, because hearing from Mr. Love and others, one of the challenges of the environment at the moment is a lot of things that were significant are no longer there because there haven't been adequate conversations in the past. And so the intent is to maintain that values connection or that cultural connection, even if the physical is not there. And so one of the challenges I had with the relief sought was to remove the overlay, which I didn't think achieved the outcome. So going through a process of ongoing conversation to get to that somewhere along the spectrum that Commissioner McMahon was talking about, I'm really encouraged by. And so I just want to meet to all of you and the airport leadership, as well as Taranaki Whānui for doing that, because I think it will lead to a better outcome for everybody. Yeah, that's.
We agree.
I think that's it from us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
With that. Okay, we'll wait 2 ticks. That's what I asked you to. Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Yes.
Okay, we'll adjourn until Mr. O'Donnell arrives.
Thanks. Have a nice weekend.
resume the hearing. Mr. O'Donnell, thank you for coming in.
O'Donnell.
What's that?
O'Donnell.
O'Donnell. So we have your quite brief comment about the tunnel and the rail deviation. Is that, what else would you like to tell us?
Well, in the original submission, there was quite a lot more detail, which regrettably I've managed to leave at the office. So that included an aerial view showing more or less where this tunnel survey marker is, and a more comprehensive report.
I suppose the question for me, Mr. O'Donnell, is that the comment from the council's heritage expert is that the information that's been supplied about the survey marker is interesting, but doesn't meet the standard of significant heritage value. And I suppose this is your opportunity to convince us why that view is wrong.
Right. No pressure then.
Well, as I say, you're just calling a spade a spade.
Yeah. Incomplete in what sense? So perhaps I could fill that.
No, it's not incomplete, but insufficient.
Insufficient. Okay. Well, perhaps first of all, I've never actually visited the site in question. It's on private property, and I understand access is quite limited. I'm only aware of one person who's actually seen it, who's presented a submission to the council. So it's part of a tunnel survey marker at 395 Middleton Road, Glenside, lot 2 DP 76164. It's one of very few surviving tunnel markers from that period in time, and there would have been 4 or 5 of them across the hillside between Glenside Road and Noronga Gorge, marking the passage of the tunnel, which was built in the 1920s and 30s and opened fully in 1937. So it's a rare survivor of a method of surveying which has long since been superseded. And as far as I'm aware, certainly the only surviving example from the construction of Tower Number 2 tunnel.
Okay, I'll ask my colleagues if they have any other questions.
Just a quick one. Does the fact that it's on private land help or hinder or change or influence at all the heritage or historic value?
Not a question I've pondered on, but I would have thought the answer is no.
So the fact that you can't visit it regularly or see it regularly or things is not in it, it doesn't have a adverse effect on the values of the marker?
I wouldn't have thought so. I think one of the questions coming before the council is the redevelopment of that area, isn't it? So, while it's a farm at the moment and therefore access is limited, any future changes could mean it's in the middle of a subdivision, and therefore we're referencing that fact as much as anything else.
One question, just as a clarification. So you haven't been on site. And we know that in the submission there is photos of the marker in its location. When were they taken?
About 3-4 years ago, pre-COVID.
Pre-COVID. And you are convinced that the marker is still where it was?
Well, without going on site to verify it, I can't answer that question. That said, it's not an obtrusive thing. We're talking about a bit of concrete and a piece of pipe sticking out of it, so it's unlikely to be affecting farm operations. Perhaps one of the surprises is that it still survives.
Thanks very much.
Commissioner McMahon, any questions?
Yes, Mr. O'Donnell, thanks for coming in. On the issue of whether it qualifies for inclusion, has significant heritage or historic heritage in the plan, that there's some guidance in the regional policy statement, and whether you know about that is immaterial, but what I can say is that the regional policy statement has a number of categories of values, if you like, that qualification could align with, and they include historic values, physical values, social values, tangata whenua values, and the like. What is it about the marker? Well, what sort of values would you draw to this panel's attention as being important to justify its inclusion in the plan?
Primarily, it's historic value. It references a project that was first mooted in 1914 and was subsequently started in 1928, and work continued throughout the Depression, so quite unique in public works programs from that point of view. It is a small and insignificant part of that project, but has line of sight to the northern portal of the tunnel, and therefore a straight view down it. Not that it does that, because the tunnel is on a different level. It is just, as I said earlier, it's a unique way, or it's a way of surveying that has now passed into history.
Yes. So two aspects here. One is its reference to an important public works program at a particular period in New Zealand's history, but also a technological reference to a previous and now outmoded form of surveying.
Indeed.
Okay. Thank you, that's useful.
I think that's all the questions we had, Mr. O'Donnell.
Thank you. My apologies for not turning up on Wednesday at my allotted time, but it was unavoidably delayed.
Ms. Bibby was a little concerned.
Yes,
that might have happened.
So I believe.
However, it's good that you were at least in one piece. Yes, given that was the day we heard after the tragic events in Newtown.
Yes.
Everybody was a little bit sensitive about these matters. However, we'll call it a day. Thank you for your contribution, and that is all of the submitters we're going to hear for stream three. So that is adjourning stream 3, and until my colleague Commissioner Schofield opens stream 4 in June.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.